Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video for the 20th anniversary of Season 1 of The Amazing Race, I'm going to be doing an in-depth retrospective of the season. I've actually already done a retrospective on this season a few years ago, but back then I didn't really have a set format for how I constructed my retrospectives, and in turn really just ended up talking about my general thoughts on the season. Didn't really go too in-depth throughout the season. So here with this retrospective, we'll be going through the season episode by episode and talking about my thoughts on the most important events throughout the season. And for me, I've said this in the past, I do think out of the three major CBS reality shows, obviously Survivor, Big Brother, Amazing Race, I do think Amazing Race 1 holds up the best out of these shows' first seasons. Like, while I would say that I probably do enjoy watching Survivor Borneo more so than The Amazing Race 1, I do think in retrospect to the rest of the show, I feel like Amazing Race 1 is the one that holds up the most. Like, both Borneo and Big Brother 2 are lower ranked seasons for me in their respective season rankings, while here at The Amazing Race 1, for me, it's a very middle tier season. Mind you, it's the season that at this point I have also watched the most. I mean, this is probably the fourth time I'm watching this, and the third time in 2 years. And I will be honest that because of that fact, like, I wasn't looking forward to really rewatching it here. But despite that, I did enjoy the rewatch. While this season definitely does have its slow points, it does have just as many really great moments as well. But with that said, let's get started running through the season episode by episode, starting with the premiere, which starts off with the old Amazing Race style of intro where we get introduced to each of the teams one by one as they exit the bus. And through this, we do get a lot of setup for some of the more prominent storylines moving forward, like Frank and Margarita trying to repair their marriage, and we get introduced to Team Guido, who talks about utilizing strategic gameplay right off the bat here. After that, we do get the now typical spiel at the start line before the race starts, and I think right away we do have a lot of interest with a lot of the teams just trying to figure out what's the best way to approach this race, with a lot of them trying to conserve their money. We instantly see an argument between Kevin and Drew, and they obviously become standout characters on this season. We do see Paul and Amy also argue over money. Rob and Brendan don't end up tipping their taxi driver, so this initial race to the airport, which nowadays would be skipped, was a lot of fun. I do think it definitely had some interesting formulative moments. But the teams travel to South Africa, and we do get a fun car chase between the top three teams, who do actually end up being the top three. And I will say that that's probably one of the bigger flaws of this season, is how straightforward the race is, where the boot order never really surprises you outside of maybe Nancy and Emily making it as far as they do, and like maybe the Pat and Brenda boot. But everything outside of that feels pretty by the numbers based on how the teams were performing. There's no real like massive blind side of, oh my god, I can't believe that team went home. Like, that never really happens here. And the final three teams on this season are very clearly the top three teams. While there is some rockiness along the way, it's really no surprise that they do end up making it to the end. But in this first episode, we do see a lot of Frank, who does come off as pretty cocky and a bit of a dick. He gets so many strong character moments throughout this episode though, and while I don't particularly like how he behaves in this episode, I do think by the end of the season, like the arc that he goes through the season, I do think makes the stuff that he does on this episode, which isn't great, like him yelling at Margarita during the bungee jump and calling her a sissy, like that sort of stuff is not good, but I do think it makes his arc over the course of the season a lot more satisfying. We do also get the intro to the fast forward here, which I've talked about my opinions in the past. I do really like this as a part of the format of these earlier seasons, where you can only use one fast forward during the entire race and you have to time it well. I mean, I get why they don't do it currently, as obviously it's very expensive to be consistently adding this new task to the show with very little benefit, and like sometimes people don't even do it. So it's like, I get it's not worth the money, but I do find it to be a pretty interesting dilemma to have this early on in the show. And Rob and Brendan do end up getting it here, but I did find it funny that Dave and Margareta end up wasting their time going for it, which, considering how far behind they were, it is funny to think that they even thought that the other teams wouldn't have gone for it. This episode does also have another great Kevin and Drew moment, this time with them arguing over how to treat the locals, and there was some really fun banter involved, and really just overall, I mean, they're just so overdramatic, with like Kevin yelling, "We're out!" in like such a ridiculous way. Paul and Amy also get a good chunk of content in this episode and are fun characters with them cheering when they realize that they're not in last. Now, something else that I've talked about in the past I do find strange is that for this first season, Phil doesn't actually greet the racers at the pit stop unless they are the last team to arrive, which I do think takes a lot of the suspense away from the teams themselves, as obviously when they see Phil there, they instantly know that they're last. And also, I just find it really awkward to have these local greeters being the ones that tell the teams their placements. As you can very clearly tell, it's just a producer telling this person what to say. It just feels very unnatural. I do feel like having the host of the show do this just makes a lot more sense, and obviously they do rectify that moving forward. But the first boots here do end up being Matt and Anna, and I haven't even talked about them yet because they don't really add much to the episode. I mean, yeah, we do see them getting lost, but I do feel like this entire premiere focuses more so on Frank and Margarita and Paul and Amy and Kevin and Drew and Team Guido and Rob and Brendan. I mean, so much so that Matt and Anna just end up being kind of forgettable here. And because I don't really have that much to really say about them. Now for episode 2, which was another pretty strong episode, which starts off with an alliance forming between what ends up being the final 3 teams here. Though the alliance here doesn't end up sticking, I mean, they break up by the time they arrive in Paris due to the Guidos having lived in Paris and deciding that they'll do better on their own. We do also get a Frank and Margarita argument at the beginning of the episode here, with Frank accusing her of lying about seeing a sign, and this was all dumb. And I did like how it was nicely contrasted by seeing Dave and Margareta's relationship, where Dave does the complete opposite in a very similar situation. Pat and Brenda do end up getting the fast forward and have some airport drama, getting upset at a travel agent. So that's something. Lenny and Karen play a major factor into this episode, with this episode showing how dysfunctional their relationship is, with Karen being this really intense competitor, while Lenny is this really laid-back guy who doesn't even seem to care about the race. And we could fast forward to Paris, where he just kind of gives up at the roadblock, which really pisses Karen off, and then he just pretends like he figured it out, only to waste their time with them going to Notre Dame and realizing that that wasn't the correct location. On his 3rd try, he finally gets it right, but you could really just tell the toll that this took on their relationship, as from this point forward, they really just look miserable every time they're on the show. The other source of drama on this episode is the rivalry between Paul and Amy and Kim and Leslie, which comes to a head at the airport, where Kim and Leslie try to skip the line for a cab, and then Paul and Amy decide to jump in their cab, and that leads to some argument. That was pretty fun. We do then see something that happens pretty often on this season, and that is Paul trying to convince Amy to quit, which obviously it sucks to see someone like Paul, who clearly doesn't want to be there, actively trying to quit. But I do think this builds upon their characters, and they do end up writing it out anyway. Like, I never really felt upset at them trying to quit the game. And to be honest, maybe it's because they are such likable characters on the show. But the boots do end up being Kim and Leslie here, with them getting really lost at the roadblock. And I did find Kim and Leslie to be pretty entertaining during these first couple episodes. I mean, they obviously brought the drama to the show. But really, outside of their feud with Paul and Amy and their general snootiness through both episodes, they don't really have that much of an impact on the overall season, especially considering that they were in the back of the pack for most of it. And again, this season really does focus on the front runners way more, and it really just leaves scraps of content for the teams at the bottom, as it really just feels like we kind of rush through the final few teams arriving at the pit stop every episode. So Kim and Leslie were fun characters. I mean, they did have that one notable moment with Paul and Amy, but they didn't really have that much time to do much else. Now for episode 3, which is another solid episode for the season. I do think this season has a pretty strong start, but really just dies off by the end. But I do find this episode really memorable, with the start of the leg revolving around finding Le Grand Roue, this Ferris wheel that closes pretty soon after the leg starts, and some of the teams that are out in front do end up making it there before it closes, while Kevin and Drew end up missing out on it by like 2 minutes, and would have to wait there for 12 hours for it to open, and because of that, they decide to go to the fast forward. And I will say that is probably one of my bigger issues with this season's format, as well as the lack of important equalizers throughout the season. I mean, I do think something that this season really struggles with is the structuring of its route, where you can clearly tell there are many points where the producers didn't really think things through, and teams get way too out in front for anyone to catch up to them, namely at the end of the season. And that is a lot of the reason why the back portion of the season is so boring, is because the teams become so spread apart that only 2 teams have a chance at winning by the time of the final 5? But with that said, there is actually an equalizer with the teams here. having to wait for the detour to open, and we do get some fun drama from the Guidos, who do end up spending the entire night sightseeing and arrive at the detour to see their former alliance now upset at them. And despite being the last ones there, the Guidos are able to undercut the other teams by seeing the entrance while the others accidentally pass by it, and that causes more drama. But interestingly, by the time of the roadblock, all the teams are actually caught up to each other, with the Guidos actually being the last of those teams to arrive to it. But the leg ends with a train ride to the pit stop, which the Guidos end up getting in trouble again, with them trying to help out the weaker teams, only for them to get separated, causing the teams to get upset at the Guidos. And it's just so funny how the Guidos just can't seem to get out of trouble, with most of the other teams' frustrations with them in this episode really just come from miscommunication. But the boots for this episode are Pat and Brenda, who, despite being the first to leave the pit stop, end up at the wrong location for the detour, and in turn end up behind the other teams, who are all very close to each other. And because of that, they do end up in last. And Pat and Brenda were pretty much nothing characters on this season. I mean, their elimination is probably their biggest moment on the season. I mean, I guess you can say they're blow up with the travel agent, but that really amounts to nothing. They don't really play that much of a factor on this season, though I do think they are probably pretty decent racers. I mean, in terms of their placements, they do pretty well in those first two legs, and I think there's an argument for them being like the 5th best team on this season. But obviously, this third leg here was pretty disastrous for them, and they do end up becoming early boots because of that. And now for episode 4, which is another solid enough episode, but I think this is probably where the season does start to lose some steam, though there are still some great moments here and there throughout the season. I mean, at the beginning of this episode, we do get some drama due to some teams calling ahead for taxis and Frank trying to take Robin Brennan's taxi, which proceeds Robin Brennan to tell their taxi driver not to help Frank and Margarita, which seemed to be a really bad social move considering they do it right in front of their faces. But really, at the end of the day, this doesn't obviously make a big difference. Paul and Amy also get some drama due to their cab not arriving, and we do get more talk from Paul about quitting, but all the teams do get caught up again, and we do get another notable Guido moment of them arranging everybody's tickets so they can get a group discount, though this leads to some chaos when some teams are given the wrong tickets. The episode does end with a notable task, though not one that's particularly interesting, of the teams running through a coliseum, but the boots here are Dave and Margareta, who lose a lot of time due to not having the right type of money to pay their taxi and having to get money from the locals, and they obviously end up being far behind because of that, though to be fair, they kind of almost caught up. But let's talk about Dave and Margareta, who, again, were fine. I mean, they seem like a lovely couple, and a couple that understood each other and got along really well despite facing a decent amount of adversity through the season. I mean, as racers, they did decent enough considering they were like the older couple of the season. They didn't always make the smartest decisions and sometimes misunderstood the rules, and obviously they were never winning the race anyway, but they're probably like a middle of the road sort of team for their archetype. Now for episode 5, which I found to be a pretty slow one. I mean, the most memorable thing about this episode is the fact that they go to the filming site of Tatooine, and they have this task of using the walkie-talkies to find their next clue. The roadblock is riding a camel, so I mean, that was something. But really, this episode was pretty bland to me. Paul and Amy do end up in last after getting lost, and Amy also gets sick along the way as well, so they didn't even end up finishing the leg here. I mean, essentially, I guess they did kind of quit. But to be fair, I mean, they were getting eliminated anyway. But again, like, I liked Paul and Amy. I found them to be a lot of fun, with Amy being someone that was really into this race while she had a partner that really didn't care and was very clearly just there to be with her. I do think Paul trying to quit at every opportunity did lead to a pretty fun dynamic in my eyes. And obviously they did get into arguments because of this, but I don't feel like the arguments ever went to a personal level. Unlike some other teams, particularly one that we'll be talking about very soon, that seemed to just yell at each other and generally hurt each other with what they were saying. I don't feel that way with Paul and Amy here, and really just come out of this feeling like they were really fun characters. Now for episode 6, which has one of the most notable moments of the season, but outside of that, the episode's just kind of okay. Obviously, the aforementioned moment comes from the airport drama in this episode, where Joe and Bill are the first to book their tickets, while Kevin and Drew, Nancy and Emily, and Robin Brennan get on the waiting list for a flight that arrives 3 hours earlier. and they eventually get those tickets with only 10 minutes to get on the flight. So the Guidos decide to try to stop them by causing some chaos at the front of the line, which is something that would never happen post 9/11. But here they did cause a commotion at the airport, which, while fun and obviously a really notable moment, it doesn't really add much outside of just pissing off the other teams, as again they get in the flight anyway. And the show really tries to ham up the situation by showing us numerous confessionals from people on each team, giving their perspective. They talk about it in future episodes. I mean, this scene is talked about so much on this season. But it's funny that despite all this drama, the flight that those three end up getting on end up screwing them over anyway, and somehow Lenny and Karen are the first ones to arrive. But also somehow they end up being the last team to arrive at the pit stop, though this was a non-elimination leg, so really it doesn't amount to much. Now for episode 7, which starts off with more talk about the Guidos' move from the last episode. Again, they really hammer this home. Also in this leg, we do go to India, which for me has never been fun on The Amazing Race. I mean, it seems like every single time they go to India, especially on earlier seasons, there ends up being some sort of creepy moment with the women having issues with the locals, like getting groped on the train, or in this situation, Nancy and Emily's truck gets surrounded by men, and again, this is just kind of a weird situation. Really just not fun to watch. Also during this episode, Lenny and Karen get a bad taxi driver, which seems to happen pretty often for them, but here it really shows the dysfunction within their relationship, with Karen yelling at Lenny for not helping her out in dealing with the taxi driver. And because of this, they do end up in last again, but this time finally get eliminated. And they essentially break up on the mat. And I mean, let's talk about Lenny and Karen, who definitely brought an interesting dynamic to the race here. I mean, obviously a couple finding out that they aren't right for each other, and the race making them realize that and further breaking them apart. But as I was mentioning before, I do feel like their fights got a bit personal at points. It definitely was not the fun type of fight to see on reality TV. As again, it felt like it was a genuine fight, like a fight that was breaking apart their relationship. And despite the drama that they bring to the season, I never found them to be that fun of a team to watch, especially after episode 2, where the arguments during episode 2, at least that does come from some humorous situations of Lenny and how he deals with the roadblock. But ever since then, it just feels like they're miserable the entire time, and that does make them less entertaining to me personally. Now for episode 8, which is another pretty meh episode. I mean, they go to the Taj Mahal, so that's something. There's some intrigue on the way there with the Guidos and Robin Brennan both having taxi issues. And Robin Brennan in particular, their taxi driver takes them in the complete opposite direction, only for them to find out that he was doing that just so they can switch out cabs, and then they just drive back to Taj Mahal anyway. That seems like a complete waste of time. We do also get a fun scene between Kevin and Drew with them losing their clue. And for me, this was one of the first notable moments of a team having this massive meltdown. We cut to commercial, and immediately afterwards, they're all right. They find the clue almost right away, so it really amounts to nothing, which obviously is a more common occurrence in modern seasons, but this is the first time I truly noticed it here. But after this, we do get more icky stuff with Nancy and Emily not even being allowed to buy train tickets, because I guess they don't sell train tickets to women in India. And bizarre. This is just dumb, and because of this, they do end up losing an hour and a half there just trying to buy tickets, which is really insane. Now, luckily for them, the Guidos do miss their first train and do end up on the same one as Nancy and Emily. But at this point, these two teams are pretty far behind the other 3 teams, with all 3 of them having reached the pit stop before these teams even get off the train. And really, at the end of the day, it does come down to a foot race, with the Guidos ending up winning out, though it does end up becoming a non-elimination leg anyway, so it didn't really matter. This does lead to episode 9, which I do think is one of the stronger episodes of the season, with most of the episode focusing on the Guidos and Nancy and Emily, who are 2 teams that are in the back of the pack at this point, and 2 teams that haven't used their fast forward, so they do end up fighting it out for the fast forward. I mean, the entire challenge coming down to chance, with them getting a bowl of coins, and whoever gets a bowl with the right number of coins to be able to put 1 coin in each pot ends up winning the fast forward. And this is probably one of my favorite sequences of the entire season. It's pretty thrilling to watch, because obviously this opens up the opportunity for a team like Nancy and Emily, this massive underdog team, to get one up on the Guidos, these villains for the season. But the Guidos do end up winning anyway, and what I love about this is that you instantly think, oh, Guidos are going to win the leg then, right? But somehow they completely botch it, which is what makes this episode so strong, as the Guidos do end up deciding to take a bus to the pit stop and decide to just wait for 8 hours for the bus instead of just taking a taxi, which every other team does. And this obviously puts them way behind. Now, going for the fast forward doesn't actually put Nancy and Emily that far behind here because the other teams actually had to wait for the temple to open in the morning as well. And theoretically, I mean, if Nancy and Emily had been probably a better team, I do think they would have had a decent shot of catching up. But after this, we do get to the detour of them essentially having to decide of whether to take a bus or find an assigned car for them, which is barely even a detour. But Nancy and Emily really do end up struggling here and just end up giving up, deciding to take the penalty, thinking that they're already far behind, which does suck to see, considering what obviously ends up happening with the Guidos, as they obviously would have survived this round had they not decided to quit here. But I will also say that I do feel like the Guidos do get kind of screwed over by this leg being really basic, as I assume they assumed that the other teams would have numerous tasks to handle, but instead they just had to find a car and walk down a path with a tiger beside it, which doesn't really take that much time. And because of that, we do end with every team but the Guidos reaching the pit stop first, and hours later, Joe and Bill arrive, and this is great, where they see the other team's shoes, they start to get worried, they get called Talk with Phil, where Nancy and Emily walk in, and it's revealed that the Guidos did come in last, but due to the penalty that Nancy and Emily got, they are the ones that are going to be eliminated. Again, a really topsy-turvy ending to this leg. But let's talk about Nancy and Emily, who are a really likable team, with them being underdogs for most of their run here, but somehow still squeaking on by to the final 5, and them even having an easy way for them to make it to the top 4. I did like their relationship with Kevin and Drew over the course of the season, and while they do come off as on a high horse at points, particularly in relation to their relationship with Team Guido, I do still think they're an overall likable team, and I do think that's also bolstered by the fact that they are the best performing female-female team on this season, in this season dominated by male-male teams. Now for episode 10, which was a pretty boring episode, with this being another non-elimination episode, and there never really being an opportunity for any placement changes here, with Robin Brennan and Frank and Margarita being way out in front and getting to the pit stop around the time that the Guidos end up leaving the pit stop. Again, they're around 8 hours behind at this point, and due to some closures, Kevin and Drew do end up getting screwed over, losing some time, making them a bit closer to the Guidos, but again, the results end up being exactly the same, so this was kind of a boring episode. But now for episode 11, which again, Robin Brennan and Frank and Margarita are way out in front and once again finish way ahead of the other teams, but that does lead to the episode focusing a lot on these two teams. And we get introduced to everything within the leg from their perspectives. And while there is some drama from Margarita's choice to do the roadblock, nothing of actual consequence happens during this part of the episode. But after they do check in, we finally focus on the other two teams, and the episode from that point forward kind of just rushes through their race. Again, there is some interesting drama involved with them racing pretty frantically because they know they're so close to each other the entire time, and the entire leg really comes down to taxi drivers, with Kevin and Drew's taking them to the wrong gate, leading to the Guidos getting to the pit stop first, meaning we do lose Kevin and Drew here. And I do love Kevin and Drew as characters. I mean, they have a great dynamic, they have some fun banter. Kevin in particular is great for his over-the-top reactions, while Drew is a pretty fun straight man to him. I do think, along with the Guidos, they are one of the most iconic teams of the season. And while they weren't the most consistent team in terms of the race, they did show some skill as well, and did get very unlucky with the placement of certain equalizers and the non-placement of other ones that do cause them to go home here. Well, I mean, also bad taxi driver, but you get the point. Now let's talk about episode 12, which was another boring episode. It was the penultimate episode, but again, we're at the final 3, and we have a non-elimination leg. It's like, why is this a thing? And they keep this for the first few seasons of the show. It's like, how do you not realize this is really boring TV? I mean, unless you have flow on your season, but obviously I already talked about that in my season 3 retrospective. But again, this one in particular is really boring because Robin, Brennan, Frank, and Margarita are way out in front. And while there is some drama stemming from trying to find the earliest flight, the leg itself is pretty boring, and it is funny how far behind the Guidos are, to the point where they only even finished the leg within the course of this episode. And let's just jump right into the finale, where we do waste some time with the Guidos at the beginning of it, who are still on the previous leg, and didn't even get to leave Alaska by the time the race is over, so that's funny. And from what I understand, this is another reason why they do add so many equalizers nowadays in Amazing Race, because of the production issues that stemmed from this. And obviously a similar thing happens with Dave and Jeff in Amazing Race 4, where these teams don't even get to the pit stop. Again, obviously, like having teams that are running previous legs while another team is running a future leg, that is terrible from a production standpoint. It just makes things way too hard on production. So I understand why they made more equalizers now. Plus, also, it just makes for a more interesting race. I mean, like, while, again, like, I think inherently you kind of think of like, oh, we want the winner to be the people that are the best at the race, like people who are good at the skills that are required to do well at the race. But at the end of the day, also, you need to make a good TV product. And I feel like while this season does end up with the top two teams, like Robin Brennan and Frank and Margarita, very clearly the top two teams of the season being way out in front, it also leads to just really dreadful TV at points. But obviously, as I said, those two teams do end up flying to New York to race to the pit stop, and it is fun to see Frank and Margarita being excited due to the hometown advantage. But we do see Robin Brennan kind of counter that. I mean, we see them pay $300 to a random person to use their phone for a day and end up booking their flight that way. I did also find it interesting how they did consider reserving all the seats on the plane to screw Frank and Margarita from getting on it, which would have been really innovative strategy and something that you wouldn't be allowed to do modernly, but it is interesting that they actually thought about it. It is also interesting to see Robin Brennan book these flights under their middle names, again, to throw Frank and Margarita off the track. While most Amazing Race finales do comprise of three teams fighting out, I actually do enjoy the back and forth between just these two teams here. And we do get to New York, where Frank tries to use his knowledge of the city to take shortcuts, which, from what I understand, Frank's use of shortcuts are actually what cost them the race, with him picking a route that would have been ideal during rush hour, but considering the time of day that they were racing, the more straightforward route would have ended up being a lot quicker, and that is what leads to Robin Brennan getting on the subway to the pit stop first. And I do feel for Frank and Margarita here when they get on the subway and they think that they've won, and Margarita is just celebrating, and they start jogging to the pit stop, still thinking that they've won, until they see Robin Brennan already there. And again, I wish they did actually present it this way. I mean, I feel like this would have been a really interesting thing to do for a modern season. I mean, obviously, the way that season 1 was edited and everything, like, you expect them to go a more traditional route there, but like, it would have been cool to see them try this sort of editing of us seeing everything from Frank and Margarita's perspective, only to find out that Robin Brennan had undercut them the entire time. But it was nice to also see Frank and Margarita holding hands as they passed the finish line. Again, a really satisfying end to their arc of being this dysfunctional couple at the beginning of the season, to them ending up with the race bringing them together. And really, for me, a Robin Brennan win here is kind of underwhelming from a story standpoint. I mean, they are pretty bland. They weren't really given an arc over the course of the season. So I do think the Frank and Margarita win would have been a lot more satisfying. But, I mean, Amazing Race has never been known for having satisfying conclusions to their seasons. But that's pretty much it for the season. I mean, let's end by talking about the final three, starting off with Team Guido. Obviously, the most iconic team from this season. I mean, they were the biggest source of intra-team drama, with them getting into conflicts with pretty much all of the endgame teams here outside of Frank and Margarita. And they did try to play the race here strategically. I do think they get unlucky with their perception at points, where there are definitely points where they are trying to play fair, but circumstances lead to them getting the upper hand without even trying, and they end up getting blamed for it. I do think their biggest weakness was being too complacent, though. I mean, you could tell there are many times throughout the season where they end up getting their tickets and think they're fine, only to be undercut by other teams getting better tickets under their noses. And that's obviously the start of their downfall in this season, where after they win the fast forward, they're just so complacent with waiting 8 hours for a bus that they end up way behind because of that. But overall, I mean, they are definitely the most memorable team from the season and probably the biggest locks coming into All-Stars. Then let's talk about Frank and Margarita, who are, again, a great team from a character standpoint with a really satisfying arc over the course of the season. Frank in particular, I think his change in attitude from how he was in the first two legs to how he is in the final leg is radically different. But also as a team, I do think they were the most consistent team of this season. I mean, Robin Brennan even had a couple of mediocre legs, while Frank and Margarita were always towards the top of the pack. So I think there's definitely an argument for them being the better team. I also think, really, if we're looking at individual racers, I think there's definitely an argument for Frank being one of the best racers in the history of the show. I mean, the fact that he was able to do as well as he did with Margarita, who, I mean, like, not a terrible racer in her own right, but definitely had her flaws throughout the season. I do think if Frank was probably given a better partner, I do think Frank could be part of one of the best teams of all time. And now for the winners in Rob and Brendan, who, I mean, it sucks to say this, but they're pretty boring. I mean, they do nothing bad throughout the season, so they aren't unlikable. They're just there. I mean, they really just run through the motions of the race. I do think there are points where it does seem like they have some pretty out-of-the-box ideas, particularly in that final episode. But really, like, as a figure on the show, they are your, what is now typical, like, smart, athletic, male team that ends up dominating the Amazing Race. And to be honest, as individual people, like, I feel like I know nothing about them outside of the fact that they're lawyers. And again, I've watched the season multiple times at this point, and I had to look up which one was Rob and which one was Brendan. And to be honest, I've been wrong the entire time. I thought it was the opposite. Again, like, nothing against them as people. They seem like fine people. But to me, as TV characters, they just do nothing for me. Now, obviously, there is some reverence for them being the first winners of the show now, to where, like, if they were to return for, like, an all-star season or something, like, I wouldn't be upset at it. Like, it would be cool to see the first winners of the show give the race a try again. But it's like, if they weren't the winners of this season, I do feel like they would be a completely forgettable team. But that's the season. Again, I do enjoy this season for the most part, despite there definitely being points that drag and the format of the season being pretty weak at points. But I do feel like it is a season that is carried by its characters, particularly like Team Guido and Kevin and Drew. Even in the slow periods of the season, there are some pretty strong character moments. I do love the first few episodes of the season, and I do think the finale is pretty riveting as well. It's really just that middle section of the season that is pretty hit or miss. But again, I do think this season has aged better in comparison to the rest of the series than the start of these other massive reality TV franchises. I know some people have been wanting me to continue on with my retrospectives for The Amazing Race. Like, obviously, I've now done seasons 1 through 5 in this similar sort of format. And I do still want to continue on with this. Like, I do want to do season 6, 7, 8, probably up to at least All Stars. But to be honest, for me right now, they're just bigger priorities. It is definitely a project I would like to return to at some point. And if there were a time slot on the schedule to where not much else is going on and I would have the time to rewatch a full season without really taking away from other videos, then I'll do it. But again, don't count on it in the immediate future. But that is it for the video. Those are my thoughts on The Amazing Race Season 1 at 20 years after the season's original run. So for now, thank you for watching.